Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. More than 100 Jewish institutions across Canada received bomb threats on Wednesday. Business groups are suggesting Ottawa use back-to-work legislation to avoid a massive rail stoppage across the country. And Whoop Up Days continues here in Lethbridge. BCN's Landon Hickok has an update of what you can expect at this year's summer festival.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Many Jewish organizations, synagogues, and hospitals across Canada received bomb threats on Wednesday morning. B'nai B'rith Canada says more than 100 Jewish institutions received an email at about 5 o'clock in the morning threatening explosions. Police in a number of cities responded to the threats, including police in Ottawa, who say officers were on site at several hospitals. So far, fortunately, no bombs have been found. Business groups in Canada say the Trudeau government can prevent a work stoppage at the country's two biggest railways. The groups say in a joint statement the government could use back-to-work legislation, or the federal labour minister can refer the dispute to the Canada Industrial Relations Board for binding arbitration. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who was speaking to reporters in Fort Saskatchewan, says a deal needs to be worked out soon since the railways are essential to the Canadian economy. She had a very strong message for the union, along with CN Rail and CPKC.
We are expecting you to work really, really hard, to negotiate in good faith, to negotiate with real energy and intensity, and to get a deal done. Your customers expect that. Your customers' employees expect that. The farmers who I saw on my way here swathing, they expect that. The people who work here, they expect that. Canada and Canadians expect that. So we know the best deals are reached at the negotiating table. We are expecting the parties to roll up their sleeves and get a deal done.
Rail service is set to stop shortly after midnight Eastern Time if deals are not reached with the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. You know, with the nation bracing for a potentially devastating rail labour stoppage, the question then shifts to how else could we effectively move our products, including our grains and oil. For the trucking industry, the increase in shipping could mean a boost in workload. Can it, however, compensate for the vast amounts of product shipping that rail is primarily responsible for? Al Nelson from CJD Trucking gave us his thoughts.
We're in a slow period in the trucking industry right now. Summer is a little bit slower as a rule. So in the short term, yeah, there's going to be more loads, especially we're in the agriculture business. So we move grain and feed commodities, which a lot of that stuff moves by rail as well. It's going to really impact the farmers as well. As far as making up the shortfall, not even close. I think I was reading there, one prairie rail car, prairie train, you would need 3,000 trucks to move that same amount of product. So with the shortage in the trucking industry of drivers, that's always been a challenge for us throughout the years. We don't have the capacity to uptick a tremendous amount. You know, are we going to be busy? Yes, I believe so. And that's short term though.
Nelson adds that potential long-term effects could slow the industry down if products cannot be moved quickly enough. The trial for two figureheads during the Freedom Convoy continues in Ottawa. Defense lawyers for both Tamara Lich and Chris Barber are challenging the prosecution's portrayal of the 3-week-long Ottawa protest as a single event under the sole discretion of the two. At issue is whether Lich and Barber crossed the line into committing crimes and encouraging others to come to the city for the protest. The trial, which began last September, has had a number of delays, but has now reached the closing argument phase. Lich and Barber have pleaded not guilty to charges of mischief, intimidation, obstruction, and other charges related to the protests which took place back in February of 2022. A not-for-profit group calling itself Concerned Constituents of Canada says all levels of government need to be more transparent. Co-founder and director Chris Weisdorf also says it's a very slippery slope when municipalities allow regulatory offenses to become criminal offenses. He says that should never happen.
What they've done is municipal and provincial governments have turned municipal bylaw and or provincial offenses, regulatory offenses, they actually turned them into hardcore criminal offenses. This occurred with Adamson Barbecue, that is Adam Skelly and his defiance and not shutting his restaurant down in November of 2020, defiance of the lockdowns, defiance of the public health orders, as well as we would see later, more than a year later, with the Convoy escalating parking infractions and noise infractions, which would ordinarily be punishable under municipal bylaw, into criminal charges.
It sounds like the not guilty verdict that was handed down to the Coutts 2 may be appealed. Crown prosecutors say they plan to appeal the verdicts handed down to both Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek. A Lethbridge jury found the two not guilty of conspiring to commit murder of RCMP officers earlier this month. They were, however, convicted of mischief and possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose. Olenek was also found guilty of unlawful possession of an explosive. Both men are set to face sentencing next week. The Alberta Heritage Fund was established by Premier Peter Lougheed back in 1976 in hopes of saving for the future. But during lean economic times, governments have taken out money from the fund. Tegan Hill, Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute and co-author of a study that's called An Alberta Dividend, the Key to Growing the Heritage Fund, looked at Alaska's permanent fund. She says the success they've had in growing their fund allows them to give dividends to residents every year. The question is now, can Alberta do the same?
I know that it's been considered in an academic realm. I know that, we're not the first to look at Alaska as an example. From this current Alberta government, I have not heard any conversation about dividends. We know again that Smith has committed to growing the fund to $250 to $400 billion by 2050, but she's not going to be our premier until 2050. That's why we need robust rules that ensure when the governments change, or even if, let's say, resource revenue declined in a year and the Smith government thought, oh no, we need more money for the budget. We need rules to make sure that that can't happen. You need to stick to those fiscal rules, and it will impose discipline on governments as well, which is really important because we don't have a lot of spending discipline for governments today.
Make sure you catch more of this insightful interview with Tegan Hill, Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute, and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up later in our broadcast. Jasper residents have been making their way back home to their homes in the Rocky Mountain town. Now, sadly, 30% of the town structures, including a number of homes and businesses, were completely wiped out by wildfires. Tourists are still not allowed back into Jasper. I asked our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, if Jasper is set to rebuild anytime soon.
I do think it's going to end up being a bit of a political issue for the Alberta government, because if rebuilding takes a particularly long time, if there seems to be insufficient temporary housing or continued tourism problems because there's nowhere for people to stay, this is going to be the sort of thing that I think reflects back on the provincial government a little bit, rightly or wrongly in that case. So yeah, the next step really is looking at what that rebuilding looks like, clearing out the stuff that used to be there, lots of insurance claims, obviously, and then the rebuilding starts.
Mr. Dawson will also have details of Premier Daniel Smith's leadership review, which is coming up at the next UCP convention, and that's coming up later in our program. Well, we got sunshine mixed with clouds again today and some light showers in certain parts of southwestern Alberta. Jeanette Rocher is now with an early look at the forecast. Jeanette, for the most part, it appears as though the weather has been cooperating for whoop-up days here in Lethbridge.
Yeah, true. Although we are still watching for that slight chance of showers and risk of thunderstorms this evening. Also, an overnight low of only 7 degrees, making it feel much more like fall temperatures these days as we get into those wee early morning hours. That's when those single digits tend to hit as we get into that morning. But as we look to Thursday, we are going to see that high of 25 degrees, lots of sunshine as well, and then an overnight low that evening of 9 degrees and clear skies. So not a bad whip-up day after all, and I'll be back later in the show to give you that full 7-day forecast. Hal?
Thanks so much, Jeanette. Divers scouring the wreck of a super yacht that sank off of Sicily found 4 bodies on Wednesday, including 1 Canadian. The search continues for 2 more missing passengers, and questions have intensified as to why the vessel sank so quickly.
I think the narrative that we're getting from the rescue team in Italy this morning is that they have probably switched from a rescue mission to a body retrieval. The vessel sank in a matter of minutes, 2 to 5, depending on the various accounts. That's particularly fast for a vessel to sink. particularly without any major structural failures. The accounts from the divers is that the vessel is pretty much intact on the bottom of the sea. So that, coupled with reports of very extreme and localized weather at the time of the sinking, it really hints at a freak accident whereby the vessel might have been pushed over on its side. And I think some of the recent survivor testimonials this morning talk about that feeling of being lifted by waves. Those vessels are built with watertight subcompartments. The idea being that should you hit something, one of those compartments could fill with water and the vessel would remain afloat.
Hundreds of mourners attended the funeral of one of the 6 hostages whose body was recovered by the Israeli military in Gaza on Wednesday. On Monday, the IDF said they recovered the bodies of 6 other hostages from the Khan Yunis region. Officials say the bodies of the 6 men who were taken October the 7th were found 10 meters or 33 feet down a deep tunnel shaft which led to an underground tunnel route. Israel says there are 105 hostages still in Gaza, 71 of whom are still thought to be alive. While the Israeli military battles the terrorist group Hamas in Gaza, it's also dealing with Hezbollah by its northern border with Lebanon. According to TBN Israel correspondent Yair Pinto, the IDF has recently destroyed a number of Hezbollah weapons and ammunition bunkers in Lebanon as it continues its campaign to erode the terrorist group's operational structure.
Massive explosions lit up the night sky in Lebanon as IDF warplanes hit Hezbollah weapons warehouses, leading to dozens of secondary explosions as Hezbollah's ammunition went up in smoke. Several senior Hezbollah operatives were also eliminated in these strikes, which effectively call Hezbollah's bluff and might even preempt any plans that they had to attack Israel in the near future. Meanwhile, Hamas announced today that it accepts responsibility for the attempted mass attack in Tel Aviv, saying that the operation was carried out with the assistance of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They also threatened to return to the tactics of launching suicide bombing attacks in Tel Aviv, as they did during the Second Intifada.
London-based Christian surgeon Dr. Leo Chang received an honorary fellowship from Cardiff University back in July. It was recognizing more than 20 years of voluntary service to the international health charity Mercy Ships. As we hear in this next story, Dr. Chang uses his skills and knowledge to bring life-saving surgical care to men, women, and children across sub-Saharan Africa.
For the past 20 years, London-based Christian surgeon Leo Chang has used his annual leave each year to serve as a volunteer providing life-changing facial surgery on board the medical vessels run by the charity Mercy Ships. And to honour his 2 decades of service, he recently received an honorary fellowship from Cardiff University in Wales. Dr. Chang says he was extremely humbled to receive this award.
I don't feel I deserve it, but partly because my input to Mercy Ship, when you compare with the long-term crew members, compare with what I call Mother Teresa surgeons, those are the real selfless, godly people.
Dr. Chang says what inspires him to keep coming back is when he sees the remarkable response of his patients when they come out of surgery and see themselves in the mirror for the first time.
The eyes pop out, mouth open, and then they have to check the mirror several times a day, several days a week, to make sure what they are seeing in the mirror are not dreaming. Because that reaction, then no money can buy. You know, that is why I did dentistry, did medicine, is to bring healing.
And Chang, along with Mercy Ships volunteers and crew members, remain committed to bringing hope and healing to many more patients in desperate need of help. Peter Wooding reporting for the Global News Alliance.
What a great story and a great honor indeed. Canada's International Development Minister Ahmed Hussein is in Ukraine, where he's pledging $5.7 million in humanitarian aid from Canada. He's visiting Ukraine's main children's hospital in Kyiv that was damaged by a Russian missile back in June. $2 million of the Canadian funding will go to Save the Children Canada, which has helped Ukrainian kids with food, education, and mental health support. Another $3.5 million will go toward medical and mental health services from International Medical Corps UK, of which $200,000 will go toward the UN Humanitarian Service. You know, there are many unsung heroes all around the world, including right here in Lethbridge. That is where the city's mighty neighbor, Summer Edition, comes in. It recognizes and celebrates those who make our neighborhoods warm and welcoming. Lethbridge's newest mighty neighbor is Neil Talbot, who's being honored posthumously. He was 75 years young when he passed away back in 2022. Talbot was nominated by his neighbor and good friend, Peter Burns.
The work that Neil did in the community to help neighbors was ongoing. Now, that was just part of his life and part of his character. He would volunteer formally at the Humane Society, and he would do things for the community at large. But above that, it was the personal touches that Neil provided to our community that made him the leader in our community.
This is something I'm used to. My dad has always done that, and it's something that he's taught myself and my brother and his grandsons as well, to try and help people as much as you possibly can. What he did for the community, he also did for his family, for both my brother and I, my two boys, Mason and Cole, and my wife and my brother's wife and my mom. This is not a shock. It's not a surprise to talk about this. This is pretty normal for us, but he just has always been there for me and the rest of my family.
Sounded like an amazing man. If you'd like to nominate a mighty neighbor, you can do so by visiting lethbridge.ca/mightyneighbors. You know, the fun of Whoop Up Days continue today. There's been no shortage of attractions for everyone. BCN's Landon Hickok got to check out all there was to offer and has more now from the Lethbridge and District exhibition.
We're here at the Lethbridge and District exhibition grounds, and I can say that the party is underway here at Whoop Up Days. And you can see there's a lot of different festivities that this festival provides, including many different types of rides. There is a swing ride that you can hear a lot of terrified people screaming. There's a lot of games where people can win prizes off of. There's a lot of different food stands, including my personal favorite cinnamon-coated mini donuts. I know I'm basic like that, but that's just me, I guess. But Whoop Up Days provides many different activities besides this festival. There's a pro rodeo starting this Thursday on the 22nd that will run until the end of the festival. Earlier I had the chance to go inside the district building where they have wildlife, including different snakes and reptiles. There's a porcupine there I thought was really adorable. They have a marketplace where they usually host the farmers market every Saturday morning. It's a hot day. There's some clouds in the sky, but I'm just going to leave the weather up to Jeanette personally. But it is a beautiful day, and I would say thousands of people are out here on the grounds today, and I expect it only to get busier. What's your favorite part of the festival so far?
Probably, I'd either say the zipper or the vertigo.
What are you most looking forward to?
Probably that new ride over there called the Speed.
I like to go on the Rockstar one.
Are you looking forward to anything else?
Probably eating mini donuts.
How you guys liking the festival so far?
So funny.
Having fun.
Having fun. Having fun.
Super fun. Like, we're so excited about the festival.
Right, they're so exciting.
Yeah, I'm from the Philippines.
Yeah.
The Philippines?
Yeah. First time going to Whoop Up.
That's so great. Yeah. What has been your favorite part of the festival so far?
I like
the games. We played every games here.
Yeah, every game. We won.
You guys try any good food here?
Yeah,
Georgina's. We tried the Filipino food truck. It was good.
Filipino food truck. What kind of food did you get?
It is like chicken barbecue and pork barbecue.
Got it. Now, it cannot be Whoop Up Days without the various food and drink options found around the festival. I got a mango Graham Delight, as it's called, from one of the food trucks in the festival. It's supposed to consist of ripe mango, caramel, sweetened cream. You know, the one thing about these drinks I really appreciate is that they're not too sweet. They're sweet just enough they can absorb all the natural flavors from the mango and the sweetened cream, and it's just so smooth and it's just a delight. I think this is going to be one of the best drinks in the festival. That's just my opinion. I'm not a food reviewer, I'm just the news. So there are many different features around Whoop Up Days, ranging from games and rides and entertainment. So if you haven't come down yet already, you got all week to do so until Saturday, until midnight each one of those days. We all have it covered here on Bridge City News.
Thanks so much, Landon. That mango smoothie looked amazing, and mini donuts, not a bad idea as well. You know, it was another beautiful day for Whoop Up Days here in Lethbridge, and the nice summer, hot weather will continue for most of the week. Full weather details are on deck. It was a fabulous day to enjoy some of the rides down at the grounds for Whoop Up Days here in Lethbridge. Also a good day to nibble on some of those mini donuts. Oh, come on, who am I kidding? Every day is a good day to enjoy mini donuts. Jeanette Rocher is now with a full look at the weather picture. Jeanette, the rodeo begins on Thursday. How's the weather shaping up for our cowboys and cowgirls?
Very nice, actually. Sunshine and 25 degrees on Thursday, which is right at the seasonal average. That's going to jump up to 30 degrees by Friday with plenty of sunshine, 26 degrees on Saturday with a mix of sun and cloud. And that would be our last day that we can get those mini donuts there, Hal. As we get into Sundays, just as well, the Move Up Days ends on Saturday because we are looking at a chance of rain on Sunday with only a high of 20 degrees, which is below seasonal. Then we jump back up to 26 degrees on Monday and 22 for Tuesday to round out that 7-day forecast. So average high for this time of year, 25, average low, 10 degrees. 35 was our record high on this day back in 1969. Record low was 1 degree, happening back in 1992. Sun rose this morning at 6:32, sunset right at 8:36, giving us 14 minutes and 14 hours, 4 minutes of daylight. Too many numbers coming at me here. Victoria looking at a high of 21 degrees. Could see a mix of sun and cloud there. Vancouver, early morning showers, high of 22, 24 in Edmonton. Edmonton seeing widespread smoke tomorrow, but that should be dispersing around noon and then making way for mainly sunny conditions tomorrow. Also, lots of sunshine expected in Calgary tomorrow with a high of 23 degrees. Now, as we get into the rest of the prairies here, Saskatoon is sitting at a high of 25 degrees. Mix of sun and cloud there. Clear skies in Regina, 26 and 25 for the high. And Winnipeg could see some showers. Risk of thunderstorms, also 30 to 50 km/h winds there in Winnipeg. Toronto, clear skies, 25 for the high. 30% chance of showers expected in Ottawa tomorrow with a high of 24 degrees. Montreal seeing a 40% chance of showers, 20 degrees for a high there, which is also a little bit lower than seasonal. As we get to the Atlantic coast here in the Maritimes, 24 for the high in Fredericton. Could see clear skies. Halifax, clear skies, but could also see a chance of rain later on in the day there. 24 for the high, 30% chance of showers in Charlottetown with a high of 24 degrees. St. John's looking at 17 and could see a 40% chance of showers or drizzle there. There you have it. That's your forecast.
Thousands of commuters are dreading the possible travel disruptions that could follow a rail strike or lockout by Canada's largest railway companies. Metrolinx says GO train service on the Milton, Ontario line and at the Hamilton, Ontario GO station would be suspended in the event of a strike or lockout at Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway. GO Transit says about 7,500 people use the Milton line daily to travel to Toronto's downtown Union Station. A Metrolinx spokesperson says the agency is closely monitoring the situation. Videotron is adding 45 more destinations where its customers with a Canada International plan can use their mobile phones without worrying about roaming charges. The increase brings the total number of international destinations to 66. Now that includes Australia, Japan, India, Vietnam, and a number of European nations. The deal comes as the Quebec-based company works to grow its wireless business. Videotron also owns the Freedom Mobile banner. Alimentation Couche-Tard Incorporated has made a pitch to take over 7&I Holdings Company Limited, which is the owner of 7-Elevens in the United States and Japan. The Laval, Quebec-based retailer, which also owns the Circle K and Ingo brands, could be on the verge of dominating the world's convenience store market. The Japan-based 7&I Holdings also holds other businesses including supermarkets, household goods retailers, financial services companies, and Tower Records Japan. While no terms of the proposal were disclosed, the managing director of Global Data called the potential takeover bid a huge deal. Now here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 84 points on the day to finish at 23,121. The Dow was up 55 points to 40,890. The S&P 500 was up 23 on the day to 5620, and the Nasdaq was up 102 points to 17,918. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down $1.24 to $71.93 US per barrel. Natural gas was down a cent to $2.18 US. Gold was down 68 cents on the day to $25.1232 US an ounce, and silver was up 16 cents to $29.60 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $7.35 per bushel, barley's at $5.44, canola's at $13.13, and corn is at $6.98 per bushel. Live cattle were up 20 cents to $181.23. Feeder cattle were up $1.05 to $239.25, and lean hogs October contract is up 90 cents to $87.33. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to $73.60 US. Recapping one of our top stories, it sounds like the not guilty verdict that was handed down to the Coutts 2 may be appealed. Crown prosecutors say they want to appeal the verdicts handed down to Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek. A Lethbridge jury found the two not guilty of conspiring to commit murder of RCMP officers. They were, however, convicted of mischief and possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose. Olenek was also found guilty of unlawful possession of an explosive. Both men are set to face sentencing next week. Premier Danielle Smith says she intends to strengthen Alberta's Bill of Rights this fall. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will explain shortly how Smith will hope to make that happen. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also, be sure to visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews. There's been talk that Premier Danielle Smith intends to strengthen Alberta's Bill of Rights this fall. The bill that passed back in 1972 predates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, there's a group within the UCP caucus who would like to see the rights of Albertans expanded to include protections for those who are unvaccinated, gun rights, freedom from excessive taxation, and the right to use sufficient force to protect property. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, some changes would fulfill campaign promises by Premier Smith, but the alteration of an Alberta constitutional document would pose some serious political challenges as well?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's a weird situation, right? Because we have the Bill of Rights, which, as you said, is from 1972, and then we have the Charter from 1982, and the Charter really supersedes sort of all these other things. I believe BC has sort of a written constitution, but it's just sort of a little bit of uncharted territory in some ways. You know, can you have a provincial constitution when you've also got a federal one? You know, how do the courts interpret this? You know, nobody's striking down legislation. No judges are striking down legislation on the basis of the Bill of Rights, really. You know, they look to the Charter and the Constitution Act. So I think it's fair to say that this is legally sort of a weird sort of area, an unclear sort of area. But politically, I think that's the case as well. I mean, the things that are looking to be added to the Bill of Rights, as you mentioned, sort of freedom from medical discrimination, I think is the way they're phrasing it. Maybe that's on the less controversial end, you know. But if we're talking about the right to keep and bear arms, that's going to be significantly more controversial in, I think, large parts of the province. So there's the political challenge there of, you know, how do you sell to someone in downtown Calgary or Edmonton or Lethbridge the idea that people should be allowed to bear arms, or the idea that people should be allowed to use, you know, some degree of weapons against someone who's on their property, right? So this is, I think, probably a tough political sell, and you have to imagine that the NDP is pretty happy to have that fight, pretty happy to argue against a right to bear arms on city streets and things like that. So it's and then the other part of it, which is, you know, it's not really an issue yet, but let's say this becomes, you know, a genuine conversation, a genuine province-wide conversation about what an Alberta constitution should look like. I mean, people of a certain age are going to remember that from the Charlottetown Accords and the Meech Lake Accords, what that conversation looked like across the entire country. What degree of similar intensity would need to be had in Alberta to have that conversation? You know, is this something that a group of people within the United Conservative Party can push for, that the United Conservative Party can create legislation or update legislation based off of, or is there going to need to be some sort of province-wide, society-wide discussion on what an Alberta constitution ought to look like? That's not a question I think that has been answered yet, or maybe even considered, but I think certainly is a relevant one. You know, if the NDP were in power, right, and said, oh, we're going to update the Bill of Rights with, you know, a bunch of progressive ideas, you'd have to think that the United Conservatives wouldn't be totally chuffed about that idea, and a lot of conservative-leaning Albertans wouldn't either. So I do think it's a really interesting question, of course. Should there be different rights, more rights, better protections for XYZ in Alberta? But, what does that conversation look like? So it's going to be really interesting. I'm fascinated by this, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's see how it all shakes down. Now, Premier Daniel Smith has a leadership review coming up at the next UCP convention, Tyler. Now, you say there's been some frustration from more of her right-leaning base that she's not pushed hard enough on some of the COVID-era questions. Can you explain?
Yeah, well, I mean, she was sort of pushed into the premier's chair or lifted into the premier's chair by people who are really dissatisfied with the sort of COVID era of Alberta politics. The vaccine mandates, the way the Coutts border blockades were handled, the charges, the public health charges that were laid against, various pastors and business owners and so on and so forth. And Smith ended up having to back off some of the promises that she made to those people, quite early on in her tenure. She promised, for example, some amnesty from COVID charges, which was something she couldn't really do because a lot of that, rests with the Crown and not politicians and things like that. So there is, I think, a little bit of frustration that she has moved towards the middle, shall we say, on a lot of the issues that a lot of the people who really supported her care about. Now, does that materialize in a really close vote at the convention in November? I don't really think so. And I think, as I was talking about with Jeanette the other week, you also don't see sort of disunity within her caucus, which you did see with Jason Kenney. We're mainly talking about some sort of grassroots frustration about some of the things that have been done. Another good example is the income tax cut that was promised and then didn't materialize in this year's budget. So I do think there's some dissatisfaction, probably among some different factions of the party's base. But, in some of the things that we're talking about right now, the Bill of Rights stuff, for example, this, I think, is a fairly clear sort of cookie to some of her longer term supporters who she's going to want on her side coming into the leadership review.
But it's safe to say that Daniel Smith will receive more than 50+1 when it comes to her leadership review.
I certainly think so. It'll be a very busy weekend for those of us in the media if that doesn't happen, that's for sure.
Now, when students return to school this fall, Tyler, there will be a ban on cell phones in the classrooms. Now, I think the legislation was brought forward back in June. Now, the policy comes into effect September 1st, but apparently school boards don't have to put these policies in place until what, the new year?
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd situation. I know I say that a lot, but it's such a good way to describe what's happening in politics sometimes. So the school boards have until basically the new year to develop their own sort of take on that policy, what that sort of enforcement or rules might sort of look like. So, I think some of the bigger school boards have got those policies in place already. There's other jurisdictions that have done this, so it's not, particularly hard to just crib from their policy proposals to make it happen. But yeah, certainly some students are not going to be allowed to be on their phones with their headphones in, texting on their iPads, or do kids even use iPads? I don't know, when they're in class. So it's, and I was reading about this yesterday because I wrote a little something about it. And there's some pretty good evidence, actually, that being distracted by digital devices has academic consequences, which is perfect common sense, of course. If you're on your phone during math class, like, of course, your math scores are going to suffer. But they really vary by efficacy depending on how they're set up, how they're enforced, whether teachers are, studiously enforcing them, all that kind of thing. So I do think that some of these sort of variety of policies we're going to end up with, might not be quite as effective, say, as a consistent policy across the board. And the other finding, the OECD did a bunch of research on this a couple of years ago, and what they found basically is that if these policies are too stringent, if kids aren't having any time on their phones during the day, they actually end up staying late on their phones when they're supposed to be going to bed, which it does make me think of when the new Harry Potter book came out, and of course everyone was dog tired the next day because they've been up all night reading. So there's a little bit of parenting, I think, that needs to come along with this to make sure that it all kind of works out. It's not just those school hours on the phone that make a difference here.
It's funny you talk about math grades. My math grades suffered, and I didn't even have a cell phone.
Yeah, well, mine too.
That's why we're both media. That's why we're journalists.
Exactly.
Yeah, not mathematicians. Now, Tyler, it sounds like Daniel Smith's pronoun policies in schools will not be ready in time for the start of the school year. She said that legislation would come out in the fall, but we really don't know what it may look like, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think it was probably clear that they weren't going to have this ready by by September 1st, by the time everyone was back in class, just because they hadn't introduced legislation in the spring sitting, and the legislature's been on break all summer. So they do really need to be back in the office, so to speak, before there's any sort of legislative or regulatory movement on this. But you're right, we don't know what it's going to look like. We have the announcement that Premier Smith made back in January, and I think we've got the broad strokes ideas of what they're looking to achieve. We don't know, I think, mainly what some of the, say, wiggle room changes might be. Are there going to be some, for example, the pronoun thing is if you're under the age of 16, you need parental consent to change your pronouns at school. Well, is there going to be some sort of clause in the legislation or the regulations that says, well, if the student says, they're in danger at home, if their parents are told, might there be some wiggle room there? And the reason I think that sort of flexibility is going to be important is it really would just maybe change what happens when this ends up in court, because it's almost certainly going to end up in court, as the case in Saskatchewan did. And that, of course, raises the question of whether or not the notwithstanding clause will end up being used. So we just don't know the specifics. We know the broad strokes. We don't know the specifics. And of course, this is going to be wildly controversial when it happens, regardless of what is actually what those policies end up looking like.
Tyler, the state of Alberta's healthcare system has been the subject of a lot of consternation over the past few years, including the recent story of a man who died during an 11-week wait to see an oncologist for his cancer. Now, in British Columbia, meanwhile, Health Minister Adrian Dix said his province is, quote, crushing Alberta when it comes to recruiting and retaining new nurses, adding, 6,000 to the province last year alone?
Yeah, and I think Alberta's numbers are more like 4,000 since 2019 or something like that. There's a pretty significant disparity between the number of medical professionals that BC is attracting and the number that Alberta's attracting. BC, for example, has also overhauled their sort of physician billing and payment structure. One of the Alberta advantages for a long time is that if you're a doctor, you could simply make more money in Alberta. The sort of fee schedule was better, and that balance of power is starting to shift. And I think there's also there's a cultural component to this too. The tearing up of the agreement between doctors and the Alberta governments really created some hurt feelings over the last few years, and the COVID era and all of that. So, but the juxtaposition really just goes to show that Alberta's it's not competing against itself for medical professionals. It's competing against the other provinces in Canada, and given that shortages of doctors, shortages of nurses are one of sort of the key and crucial problems facing the Alberta healthcare system, and frankly the Alberta or the healthcare system in every other province, this competition is important, and the Alberta government, I think, probably is looking at this, but certainly, this is part of the discussion. If we are struggling to retain doctors and they're all going to BC, well, should we try and one-up BC in some way? So I think this is something we're going to keep hearing about, especially as the reorganization of Alberta Health Services and all that continues. But it's just an interesting bit of hard data on the sort of hungry hippos of nurse and doctor retention.
That's a nice flashback. Thank you for that. We've all seen the devastating images of the wildfire which wiped out around 30% of the town of Jasper. Residents are being allowed to return home, or for some, sadly, returning home to rubble. Now, tourists are not yet allowed back into Jasper. So, Tyler, what's next? We're doing the rebuild now?
Yeah, well, it's presumably going to be a fairly long road to the rebuild. I think the rebuild for Slave Lake and for Fort McMurray were long roads, and one of the complicating factors in Jasper, of course, is the sort of multi-jurisdictional nature of Jasper. The federal government is involved because it's in a national park. There is a municipal government that has some powers. And then there's the provincial government as well. So I hope it's clear to the people who are behind the scenes working on this stuff whose responsibility is what and how this is all going to shake out. Because I do think it's going to end up being a bit of a political issue for the Alberta government. Because if rebuilding takes a particularly long time, if there seems to be, insufficient temporary housing or continued tourism problems because there's nowhere for people to stay, this is going to be the sort of thing that I think reflects back on the provincial government a little bit, rightly or wrongly in that case. But So yeah, the next step really is looking at what that rebuilding looks like, clearing out the stuff that used to be there. Lots of insurance claims, obviously, and then the rebuilding starts. But because there's so many governments involved in some way, I do think it's going to become a little bit of a political hazard, shall we say, for the Alberta government, because Albertans, they feel strongly about Jasper and feel strongly about the national parks, and so if there's the sense that this isn't going fast enough, if it isn't happening in the way that people in Jasper want, I do think there's some political risk there for the Alberta government, and frankly probably for the federal government as well.
Harvest season has begun. In many parts of the province, the harvest has been actually better than previous years. And there were a lot of concerns, like you and I talked about this before, that the dry winter we had last winter would have a negative impact on crops. But thanks to some spring and summer rains, some farmers have enjoyed a pretty good growing season.
Yeah, it seems to have been not bad. I think about 25% better yields, sort of on average across the board, is what the Alberta government's saying at this point. As you say, there were lots of rains in the spring, which really helped for seeding and early season farming. But then it was a very hot, dry summer in parts of the province for good chunks of the last couple months. So yeah, harvests are looking better. To go back to the math thing, this is a bit of a math problem. Better than average, but of course the average has gone down in the last few years because there's been so many bad harvests. So it's better than average, but that average has slid over the last 5 or so years as well. But either way, I think for the province's farmers, this is sort of unambiguous good news, and hopefully a sign that this sort of long-term drought situation that we're in is maybe slowly improving.
Absolutely. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Well, the Alberta Heritage Fund has been around a long time, and it dates back to the Premier Lougheed era with the hopes of saving for the future and diversifying our economy. But it sure got raided a lot in those lean times, and it makes you wonder if we should have bitten the bullet and just kept it growing. So joining us today to discuss this further is Tegan Hill. She is the Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank. Tegan, great to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So Tegan, you recently co-authored a study entitled An Alberta Dividend, the Key to Growing the Heritage Fund. So what is the UCP government hoping to do with the Heritage Fund?
Well, the Alberta government has committed to growing the Heritage Fund to between $250 to $400 billion by 2050. That's a worthy goal, but we know based on the history of the Heritage Fund that governments have a really hard time sticking to that commitment. So what we've done in this study is actually look to Alaska. They've had a lot more success growing their fund, and part of that comes from using a dividend.
Yeah, right. So how much money do we have currently in our fund?
We're maybe 23 billion projected for this year, somewhere around that. For context, well, let's use the same years. So when we looked at the data in the report, up to 2022-23, the latest year of comparable data, the Alaska Fund was worth $78 billion in US. That's about $90 billion in Canadian. And again, that same year, we were at about 20 billion. So they've had a lot more success at growing their fund than we have here in Alberta.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So your study obviously looks at the success that Alaska has had with its Resource Revenue Savings Fund, and you're suggesting that we could do something similar here in Alberta. So how large is the Alaskan fund now? You kind of just sort of mentioned it there, and how much of a dividend are Alaskan residents typically receiving annually from that amount?
Right. So again, let's talk USD. So we're looking at a $78 billion fund. The fund has paid over $30 billion to Alaskans since its inception, actually, which was the same year. It started the same year as Alberta in 1976. And on average, in inflation adjusted terms, Alaskan residents are receiving a $1,900 dividend annually.
Wow. So how does Alaska do things? Like, do they have a mandatory percentage of oil revenue that the government is required to deposit into the savings fund no matter what?
Yeah, so since inception, they have had a constitutional rule that 25% of resource revenues have to be saved in their fund. They also have a rule that the fund has to be inflation proofed annually. And then they've had that dividend since 1982, which has really enforced and created robustness around those fiscal rules. Because Alaskan citizens can see how the fund's growing. It's reflected in their dividend. If it's not growing, they're going to be upset, and that creates that political pressure. What's interesting is that Alberta actually also had started with a minimum contribution rule, 30%, but it was statutory in nature. A statutory rule is very different from a constitutional rule, which has existed in Alaska.
Okay, isn't that interesting? So the Alberta Heritage Fund has gone up and down like a yo-yo over the years, and part of the issue is that various premiers have taken funds to top up budget shortfalls rather, in tougher economic times, right? So does Alaska have any rules preventing this?
Yeah, so again, a constitutional rule similar to the 25% contribution prohibits the government from accessing the principal of the fund. So the earnings are used to inflation proof, pay out that dividend, create that robustness around fiscal rules for the fund, that public buy-in that creates that political pressure to maintain the fund. And then it's paired with these really strong constitutional rules, which mean that the government cannot draw on that principle, as governments in Alberta have done so often in the past.
Okay. Now, Tegan, your study says that the key to growing the Heritage Fund is the dividend. So what is it about giving citizens ownership shares of state resources that seems to cause proper management of the savings fund?
So when they receive that check every year, it's salient to them. That dividend is the return that the state is getting from its resource revenue is visible to them through that dividend. And then if that dividend falls, again, there's that visibility to know how the government's managing the resources. What does that look like? And so we know that it's been effective because the state has delivered dividends since the existence of the fund. It's even topped up the fund beyond what would be needed to meet its minimum contribution requirements in certain years to avoid having that dividend fall. What's interesting about the dividend is that it's based in statutory law. It is subject to legislative appropriation and veto by the state governor. But even though it's in statutory law, which again, and I can explain the difference between that and constitutional, but that's a much weaker fiscal rule, yet the government continues to stick to all of its commitments to managing and growing the fund because of that dividend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, like like when we feel a sense of ownership over something, we're going to have our say in it, and we tend to take more caution if it's our own money that we're looking at. So yeah, totally understandable. It's an interesting system that they have there in Alaska, for sure. Something that Alberta should look into. Do you know if the province has looked into sort of adopting some of those methods that the Alaskan government has been doing?
I know that it's been considered in an academic realm. I know that, we're not the first to look at Alaska as an example. From this current Alberta government, I have not heard any conversation about dividends. We know again that Smith has committed to growing the fund to $250 to $400 billion by 2050, but she's not going to be our premier until 2050.
Right.
That's why we need robust rules that ensure when the governments change, or even if, let's say, resource revenue declined in a year and the Smith government thought, oh no, we need more money for the budget. We need rules to make sure that that can't happen. You need to stick to those fiscal rules, and it will impose discipline on governments as well, which is really important because we don't have a lot of spending discipline for governments today. And that's a separate but very related issue. And the Heritage Fund could help with that.
Yeah. Okay, so if I understand correctly, the Alaska government does retain the authority to reduce or even eliminate the dividends for its citizens. However, it's interesting to note that it's never done this in over 40 years. So what does that tell us?
It tells us that there's a lot of political pressure to maintain that dividend, and that dividend is linked to the growth and success of the fund. So it tells us that that dividend is really, really key. And again, I think a lot of Albertans are familiar with the Heritage Fund, but they don't keep tabs on, is it 20 billion, is it 40 billion, is it X, Y, and Z, because they don't see each year what that fund is looking like. This dividend is going to tie the performance of the fund to people individually, and as rational individuals, you want a bigger dividend than a smaller one, especially right now when so many people are struggling with affordability. I think introducing this dividend, it could be very impactful at this time when I think people are paying even more attention to their pocketbooks. It could be a huge success in Alberta.
So if Alberta were to implement these rules for our Heritage Fund, how much would it grow and how much of a dividend could we potentially see in our province?
So it would, by this year, we could pay dividends of about $150 to $300 per Albertan. That's also assuming that we make contributions like Alaska, 25%, and we inflation-proof the fund. Now, that's not a huge number. Over 3 years, it'd be $600 to $1,100 per Albertan, though. And if you look at a family of four, that's about $2,300 to $4,400 over 3 years. Again, the thing with the dividend is that it will grow from there, right? So eventually we could see dividends, and not in the too distant future, because we have such significant resource revenues that are similar to the size of Alaska. That does make a big impact. And again, even today, I think a $300 check, people would start paying attention just because, again, budgets are so tight right now. So I do think it's still an opportunity to start today, and that it could, again, deliver really meaningful dividends to Albertans.
Oh, definitely. You were mentioning that the average Albertan doesn't know how much the Heritage Fund. So with that said, is there a place that we can go? Is it public knowledge? If it's not, it should be.
Yeah, so there is typically data on the Heritage Fund in each provincial budget. You can also go to the Heritage Trust Fund. I don't know the exact website, but you can look at the fund. You can look at the annual reports and all of that. And then in terms of analysis, FraserInstitute.org, we have several studies on the Heritage Fund, looking at the issues it's had in the past, again, how we can resolve that. And so there is a lot of information out there. I do recognize, though, that an everyday Canadian, without having, again, that link to the fund financially, at least in a really visible way, it's probably not something they're going to keep tabs on, and that's why this could be so effective.
Yeah, exactly. It gets forgotten about for sure. Okay, so Tegan, I know your study doesn't deal with this question, but any thoughts on how favorable the public would be to these kinds of rules, and whether the UCP or the NDP would potentially be interested?
It's tricky. We're not political commentators. I think based on rational individuals, like going back to the principles of people are rational, right? They're going to make decisions based on what makes the most sense for them, and the public opinion is what's going to sway the political decision. And so again, right now, I think people are feeling the cost of living. I think that a dividend like this could make a lot of sense for everyday Albertans. And particularly the potential for those dividends to grow. And I think if it's supported by Albertans, then it's going to, it would make sense that it's then supported by political parties, but we're going to have to wait and see. Smith is going to deliver a plan this fall on how she's going to grow the fund to that amount. So we'll see if dividends is in the picture.
Well, I think realistically thinking, if you consistently put resource revenue into the Heritage Fund, does it mean that in the short term it reduces the money available for the annual provincial budget? So, that could mean spending cuts, right? So I think that's sort of a tough sell sometimes, especially if it's an election year, right?
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. But what I would say is that right now, Alberta's spending levels are too high. So our spending levels are based on one-time windfall resource revenue. We have historically very high resource revenue today, but we know that that can change in an instant, and then we're in a deficit. So we actually want and should, for the sustainability of provincial finances, the government should be getting spending more under control and actually reining in spending. So this policy would support that. But again, it is fair to say it would take a hit to the budget. We would now be allocating some resource revenue to the Heritage Fund. So you make a great point. Politically, I think that would have an impact, and that's going to probably go into the thought process of the Smith government.
Okay, so if viewers agree with this study, what should they ask their MLA and Premier to do?
To take a close look at how they can have a more successful Heritage Fund, to think about a dividend, to start talking about these types of policies, because the last thing we need is more statutory rules, which are effectively just promises. A statutory rule can be changed unilaterally by the Alberta legislature. So the government can say, we're going to commit to this, and then 6 months later, they can say, we're no longer going to commit to that. So we need to be pushing for robust constitutional rules. We need to be pushing for a dividend, and we don't want to hear more of the same. We don't want to hear about the promises that have been made over the last 50 years that have failed. We need a new approach to growing the fund.
Very insightful. Well, thanks so much for sharing this with us today, Tegan. I learned a lot. I hope our viewers did too. Thank
you for having me.
Tegan Hill is the Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute, and you can read the study at fraserinstitute.org. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.